Just quickly recapitulating, David is elected king. It's a constitutional monarchy, not an absolute monarchy. One of the rare expressions of that in the ancient world, found more or less uniquely in the people of Israel. That takes place in chapter 5. David immediately wants to move the capital from Hebron, which was distinctively associated with his own tribe, Judah, to a more neutral venue, so moving north to Jerusalem. But before he could really get going on his plans, he's attacked twice by the Philistines. They didn't like the idea of this well-known genius warrior running Israel, and so they tried to make quick work of him. They are not successful on 2 occasions. That's part of why David launches his own campaign against them, as we just saw at the beginning of this chapter. Having at least neutralized them briefly, he brings the ark to Jerusalem. His plan was that would be phase 1. He was then going to build a great temple to house this ark, creating not only a political but a religious capital for Israel, unifying the hearts of all the diverse Israelites and their various tribes in one central place where a central sanctuary could be the place of their worship and more or less unifying them. But of course his plans were interrupted because, as we said earlier, instead of building a house for God, God said, "I'm going to build a house for you." And we have the Davidic Covenant in chapter 7. So that brings us now to chapters 8 and 9, in which we find in chapter 8 really kind of a summary of David's dealings with surrounding countries, surrounding nations that were at least initially hostile to his rule. Beginning with the Philistines, who David subdued. He took a place called Meteg Ammah from the hand of the Philistines. That is actually an alternative name for Gath. By this time, Gath had become the primary city ruling the other 4 major Philistine cities, and so by taking this one, he really inserted himself into a controlling position with respect to all of the Philistines. From this point on, throughout the rest of David's career, and really interestingly, throughout the rest of Israel's history, you don't hear so much about the Philistines being an ongoing threat. They had been a major problem up until this point, and yet somehow this becomes a defining moment in which the Philistines cease to be as much of a threat as they had once been. This brings us to verse 2. We hear that David defeated Moab, and then this interesting description. Commentators divide a little bit over how we are to take this. Did David kill half the fighting men of Moab or 2/3 of them? The Hebrew is slightly ambiguous at this point, but one thing is clear, that David was in a sense once again neutralizing Moab with respect to being some sort of ongoing threat. Moab is on the other side of the Dead Sea, off to the east. David had been on friendly terms with them, so we're a little surprised to hear that there was this conflict with Moab. You may recall that when David was running for his life from Saul, he was fearful for the welfare of his family and dropped off his mom and dad with the king of Moab, and probably reminded the king of Moab that he himself had some Moabite blood in him. His great-grandmother was Ruth. And it seems at that point there was a cordial relationship between the two. Something happened. Commentators generally regard this as likely what happened was a new king came along in Moab, somewhere along the line, who was less friendly toward David. There's even been some speculation among some that the parents of David may have been executed by a Moabite king, kind of picking a fight. That's all speculation. This remains somewhat obscure as to exactly what precipitated this particular conflict. But one way or another, they wind up in this battle in which David, of course, is successful, and he either takes half the lives or even 2/3 of the lives of the fighting men and executes them. We're a little put off by that. It seems a little harsher than we might have hoped. On the other hand, there's not a century in human history when we haven't seen something like that, and many times worse. And in fact, if you compare David's behavior against the backdrop of the time in which he lives, this is quite lenient. You look at what the Assyrians were going to do in a few years, what the Hittites had already done, what others took for granted as a standard practice in the day, and David's behavior here is actually pretty gentle, you see. I'm not trying to fully justify it, I'm just saying that we need to take things in a bit of a context, and at this point, I think we can give David a little bit of at least some kind of understanding nod at this juncture, given what happened here. So anyway, David is able to establish a relationship with the Moabites in which they are going to pay tribute. He doesn't establish garrisons there. He doesn't try to occupy them. He leaves them to manage their own affairs once he has brought them under control. That relationship, by the way, continued for some 150 years or so, and then Moab was able to wiggle out from under the control of Israel. This was during the reign of Ahab. We find evidence of that both in the Old Testament and also based on what's called the Moabite Stone, a stele really that was discovered by an Anglican missionary in 1868. It has a very interesting history. If this were a different course, we'd spend more time looking at it, but it describes the king then of Moab, whose name was Mesha. And Mesha erected this stone in 840 BC, celebrating how Moab had finally escaped from the dominion of Israel, a dominion that extended all the way back to the time of David. So one scholar summarized the content of the Moabite stone in the following words. Mesha, the king, tells how Chemosh, the god of Moab, had been angry with his people and had allowed them to be subjugated to Israel, but now had returned and assisted Mesha to throw off the yoke of Israel and restore the lands of Moab. Now, we, of course, would take a somewhat different theological perspective on the content of the Moabite stone, but the fundamental events match pretty well with what we read in the Old Testament. It becomes one of those rare but helpful external corroborating evidences that gives us some additional insight into the biblical narrative. Interestingly, the Moabite stone also makes specific reference to the house of David, which of course is interesting to us because there have been those from time to time who've said David is just a fictitious character. But, you know, for a fictitious character to show up in this piece of archaeological artifact would be somewhat unexpected. It also makes reference to Yahweh, the God of Israel. So for those reasons and others, that's been an interesting discovery. The next conflict that is described for us was against a character named Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to recover his territory at the river Euphrates. Now, Hadadezer rules way to the north. The circled piece of the map there, way up at the top, is the region that he ruled, and it's a long way from where David was occupied in his military involvements at this point. For some reason, Hadadezer comes swooping down a fair amount of distance in order to participate in a battle with David. The reason is because he was hired by the king of Ammon, who had picked a fight with David, realized he had a tiger by the tail, and hired Hadadezer as a mercenary army to come down and help him out. And so again, Hadadezer is not being attacked by David, but is actually attacking David, picking a fight in which he's going to come out the worst. The reason that the reference is made here to his territory, that is to David's territory, presumably at the river Euphrates, has been somewhat obscure. However, the speculation is that when David was fighting under King Saul in that region, certain territory had been taken that was later forfeited. And so it may be that that's the territory that's in view, but that's a somewhat disputed point. So David took from Hadadezer 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, 20,000 foot soldiers. David hamstrung all the chariot horses, David the brutal once again, except that he spared enough of them for 100 chariots. And so David, attacking what is a very significant military force here, 1,000 chariots is a very respectable army in the ancient world. He neutralizes, of course, this attacking power or potential for attack from Hadadezer, but he does keep 100 chariots The rule that applied to kings by Moses' law in Deuteronomy 17 prohibited kings of Israel from multiplying chariots or horses. This was to prevent them from becoming an offensive army. Israel was permitted to fight defensive wars, traditionally called just wars, but not gratuitous wars of conquest, running out and taking over surrounding neighbors. And so a modest army was permitted, but not a great military machine that would create the opportunity for some kinds of conquest that would be beyond the parameters of what God had authorized. And so David keeps 100 chariots and 100 horses, and that probably fits within Moses' guidelines. When the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David killed 22,000 of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became David's servants and brought tribute. So the Lord preserved David wherever he went. I know this is more about David's military career than you probably wanted to know, but it's very interesting that this kind of summary that we have here is unpackaged for us in some greater detail later. For example, we're going to look at a little bit of this next week, but we're going to see it from the perspective of what happened with David in his war with Ammon that led to the incident involving Bathsheba. And so if you kind of keep your eye on the big picture, it'll help us appreciate how some of those events in that smaller picture may have occurred. This Syrian army was hired by Hadadezer. He had been hired by Ammon as a mercenary. Now Hadadezer gets in trouble. He hires the Syrians. In each case, what the author wants us to understand is David is not out there picking these fights. He is the one who's responding to others who are in a sense engaged in a conflict against him. So again, we would say these are defensive wars, but the net effect of it is David is able to extend his control over a goodly piece of real estate as a result of those conflicts. David took the shields of gold that belonged to the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. Also from Betah and Berotai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took a large amount of bronze. All of this stuff David brought to Jerusalem, put it in cold storage, because eventually Solomon would use this stuff to build the temple that was going to be erected by him in Jerusalem. Then Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadadezer. Then Toi sent Joram, his son, to King David to greet him and bless him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had been at war with Toi. And Joram brought with him articles of silver, articles of gold, articles of bronze. Toi could have gone either way. He's another ruler up to the north, not too far from Hadadezer. They'd been in battle, but he could have adopted the philosophy that says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He could have joined forces with Hadadezer. He could have launched an attack against David, but he doesn't. Smarter king, you see. He figures, whoa, I don't know that I want to mess with this guy. I think I'd like to be on friendly terms with him. And this again suggests to us that David is not out there trying to pick fights with people. When Toi comes to him and says, let's enter into a friendly treaty relationship here, David is more than happy to oblige himself to that. And so this sending of the son of Toi, Joram, it's a token of high esteem, and they enter into a more cordial relationship. This seems to be the backdrop for comments that David makes at times in the Psalms. For example, in Psalm 18, he says, "You've delivered me from the strivings of the people. You've made me the head of the nations. A people I have not known shall serve me. As soon as they hear of me, they obey me, and foreigners submit to me." David almost himself seems somewhat astonished at the remarkable success that he seems to be having in a conflict with what appear to be superior forces, all marshaled against him, and yet somehow he keeps coming out on top. And David seems to appreciate that that's something more than simply military genius on his part. David also delivered these, that is the gifts from Toi, delivered them to the Lord, along with silver and gold that he had dedicated from the nations that he had subdued, from Syria, from Moab, from the people of Ammon, the Philistines, from Amalek, from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, son of Zobah. So all of this also is put into storage to be used eventually by Solomon in building the temple. All of these nations, therefore, became tribute-paying nations and represented a kind of buffer set of countries surrounding Israel and giving her some protection from the threats that might have even come from further afield. David made a name for himself when he returned from killing 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. There tends to be consent among commentators that the word Syria here should be Edom. It only takes an adjustment of one letter in the Hebrew alphabet to change the one to the other, and it makes a lot more sense in the context. So probably this is referencing the Edomites who dwell in the south. And so what happened was while David was engaged in these battles in the north, the Edomites are attacking from the south, trying to capitalize on the vulnerability of Israel now, while David is occupied elsewhere. And so he has to respond to that, and once again the Edomites are decisively defeated, largely through the actions of Joab and his brother Abishai at a place called the Valley of Salt, which is near Beersheba. David wrote the 60th Psalm to celebrate that victory, the title of which is a Mitkam of David for teaching when he fought against Mesopotamia and Syria of Zobah. Those were in the north. And Joab returned and killed 12,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. Edom had always been restive. They were always kind of up for a battle, a fight, and so David actually does put garrisons there. He put the means of really controlling them militarily there, and they remained there for some time to come. Again, we hear that the Lord preserved David wherever he went. Well, what does it look like? By the time all the dust is settled, David controls a pretty substantial piece of land there. It extends down into the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula. It extends up to the river Euphrates, into northern Mesopotamia, and all points in between. Much more, of course, than David might have ever anticipated would be under his dominion as a result of these military engagements that took place about this time in his career. One commentator was noting that it did establish at that point at least a bit of an empire. But the commentator notes somewhat sadly, it would not last for long. It survived through Solomon's reign, but then the entire thing fragmented. Eventually, Assyria and Babylon would rise, but would not last for long. And he concludes there's only one kingdom that will last forever. So amen to that, huh? In all of the dust that's blowing around in the air, there's one thing we can appreciate in all of this, that the kingdom that David established at this point, as impressive as it may have been, was not intended to be a permanent, eternal, political or religious circumstance. It was only an anticipation, a harbinger of a much greater kingdom that would be established by the greater Son of David. And so we hear that David reigned over all Israel, administered judgment and justice to all his people. There was a fault line between Judah and the other tribes, but at least for a while, the semblance of unity is there. After the reign of Solomon and the foolish decisions by Rehoboam, of course, the thing fell apart. But in the meantime, David seems to have run a pretty tight ship, at least at the beginning. It appears that after the incident with Bathsheba, things began to deteriorate a bit, and David was dealing with all kinds of family problems and other conflicts such that his ability to handle the judicial responsibilities were somewhat, there was a little bit of slippage there, you might say, but at least for a time, this seems to have been the way that things were working out, and the administration of David seems to have been in pretty good shape. These last two verses just summarize for us briefly the administrative side of David's reign, and then we get to the next chapter, the story of Mephibosheth. So Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilub, was the recorder. Joab, a man who's been called one of dog-like loyalty, competent, devoted, just everything that a person could want, but a little too much. And so Joab, as you know, though he could be very, very loyal, could be a little bit violent, a little over the top, and gave David some grief from time to time. But nevertheless, he's there serving David faithfully throughout his career. And so for that, we appreciate the contribution he makes. Jehoshaphat, the recorder, the job he had was, as the Hebrew word suggests, to be the remembrancer. Meaning when David gave an oral decree, let's say in a court action or something like that, this man made sure it was reduced to writing and that it was executed. So in some ways, he was the guy that made it happen, and that was his job. Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were the priests, and Sariah was the scribe. From this point on, we hear more about Zadok and less about Abiathar. If you've been in the class, you know that Abiathar is a name we've seen frequently. He was associated with the house of Eli, and the lineage of Eli was eventually set aside, based probably on the prophecy given by Samuel years earlier, and thus Abiathar is kind of the last ember of that line. It was required in Moses that the priesthood be descendants of Aaron. Zadok was also a descendant of Aaron, but a different line. And so we find Abiathar now is kind of being shifted aside, and Zadok becomes the name normally associated with the rule of David. And the line of Zadok continues to be the priestly line in Israel for hundreds of years, all the way down to the Maccabean revolt. The last priest of the line of Zadok was a man by the name of Onias III, who was gratuitously assassinated, part of the run-up to the Maccabean revolt. And from that point on, priesthood in Israel became a political appointment rather than based on a religious lineage. And so at the time that Jesus was alive, the high priest in Israel was not of the line of Aaron. It all changed here at the Maccabean revolt. But for many, many years, of course, the line of Zadok had that position. Sariah was said to be the head scribe. That'd be something like the Secretary of State. Jehoiada was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. These are foreigners. They're something like the Swiss Guard at the Vatican. They're ferociously loyal to David, but they don't have any particular association to Israel other than that they live there in good standing, But their main purpose was to defend and protect and guard David, and they did so with a great deal of competence. Many speculate that they actually originated from Crete and may have been descendants of the Minoan civilization that had, of course, long since passed from the scene, but that remains speculation. Joab commanded the citizen soldiers of Israel, and so we have both these who are the elite fighting force belonging personally to David, and then those who represent all of Israel. David's sons said to be chief ministers, literally priests, though they weren't priests, more like chaplains, maybe officers, rounds out the story. So it's a semblance of unity, and it's David really at the height of what probably we would call the glory of his reign. Everything's going to go a little bit sideways in our next time together next week, but this next chapter is one of my favorites, and if you're familiar with it, I'm sure one of yours as well. And so this is the moment in which David now, having achieved a bit of peace in his reign, is trying to make good on promises that he had made many years ago to his good friend Jonathan. So David asks, this is beginning chapter 9 now, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. My son named his parakeet Ziba. That's important. I wanted you to know that. He quizzed me once, actually, my son did, because he thought I wouldn't know who Ziba was. And he asked me, do you know who Ziba was? And I said, of course I know who Ziba was. But my son underestimates me, you see. All right, anyway, back to work here. Now, there was a guy by the name of Ziba, and he was summoned to David. The king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, at your service. The king said, is there anyone remaining of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? Ziba said to the king, well, there remains a son of Jonathan, but he's crippled in his feet. The king said to him, where is he? Ziba said to the king, he's in the house of Machir, son of Amiel, at Lo-debar. So, David, wondering if there's somebody left of Saul's house to whom he could show kindness. There's actually were quite a few left, but more of them more or less hiding out in obscurity, under cover, because they feared that David might actually go on the warpath against them, which would be the common practice in the ancient Near East. But David was actually remembering the promise that he had made to Jonathan. You may recall that remarkable story of one of the conversations between Jonathan and David. We covered it, of course, weeks back, in which David was asking Jonathan, please protect me from your father. There's only a step that separates me from death. Jonathan, always trying to defend his father, think the best of him, nevertheless understood David's concern. And Jonathan made promises to David that he would do everything he could to protect him. And then, as if in an epiphany, Jonathan saw ultimately David had to be the king. That finally, David was the one who would be in the power position. And unexpectedly and rather dramatically, the tables turn in that conversation years earlier. And this is Jonathan speaking now, saying to David, you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Jonathan pleading for mercy from David, who was at that time the guy who was out there running for his life. How unexpected was that? And yet somehow Jonathan saw it. And of course, Jonathan said, when God has given you peace from all your enemies, you will not forget this. And David woke up one morning, looked around and said, hey, God has given me peace from all my enemies. All of these surrounding nations had taken their best shot, and all of them had come up empty-handed. And now David was in this position of having all of these paying tribute to him, respecting him, and recognizing him as the proper ruler of that whole region. And David remembered the conversation that he had had years ago with Jonathan. He remembered, of course, also Jonathan's promises to David. For his part, David had said to Jonathan, you shall deal kindly with your servant, for you've brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. And all of that came back to David at this point, of course, and now he has the opportunity to make good on that. So, he wants to know who's out there. There was a servant of the house of Saul. His name was Ziba. David called him, confirmed his identity. Ziba was not a family member of Saul, but he was one of the chief servants of Saul. And on the death of Saul and the death of Jonathan, and the fact that the other family members of Saul were hiding out in obscurity, they didn't want to take open possession of Saul's properties for fear of David. And so they were living in somewhat quiet circumstances, hoping to just stay under the radar. That was, we don't know how many there were, but there were certainly some. And they were out there. So Ziba, as would be customary, became the trustee of all this property. And Ziba, this is a subtext to this story that we have to keep in mind, would have eventually inherited that property if nobody else made a rightful claim to it, which was not likely to happen. So Ziba was actually in line to become an extraordinarily wealthy man based on his management of Saul's property at this point. And now Ziba is being called in before the king. And the king asks the question, is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said, well, yeah, there's a son of Jonathan, but he's lame in both his feet. And that's really the sense of this. It's like Ziba is trying to minimize this guy, you know. He doesn't want any kind of overt attention. He'd like to just leave everything as is, copacetic, let things go on. And he doesn't want David to fixate on Mephibosheth as some sort of threat, because that's what Ziba thinks is going on. He thinks David's playing a game trying to smoke out anybody that's hiding so that he can get rid of any remnant of Saul's family. That's the way it's done in the ancient world. Ziba's a cynic. He knows that that's probably what David has in mind. And this nonsense about showing him kindness is just a smokescreen to pull these people out of hiding, you see. So that's kind of what's happening in Ziba's mind. Now, I know I'm way out there, probably some of you think, speculating on this, but this is at least a way of understanding this that makes some details of it make slightly more sense. So anyway, Ziba acknowledges there is this one son. David wants to show him extraordinary kindness, and notice this, David wants to show him kindness based on a covenant that Jonathan and David had actually shared together, a covenant in which Mephibosheth himself was not even a party. Jonathan's love for David and David's love for Jonathan was going to flow into unbelievable benefits for Mephibosheth. Some commentators, reflecting the view of the vast majority of Christians in history that believe infant baptism is appropriate, see in this a little hint of what happens in the church when parents in a covenant relationship with Christ and the church bring a child, a newborn, who's not a party to any of this, and yet that child is going to become the recipient of great benefits based on a covenant relationship to which the child at that moment is not even a party, not even aware of it. We see a little hint of that. I'm not going to push the point too far, but some commentators have noted that particular element in this story. He was lame in both his feet. This injury took place when he was 5 years old. Word had just reached the family of Saul that Saul was dead, Jonathan was dead, the armies of Israel had been decimated, and it was not looking good, and in a panic everybody was running for their lives, and this 5-year-old boy was kind of caught in the mayhem and apparently fell, broke bones probably in both his ankles. They were not properly set, and so from that time on he'd been crippled. And in the ancient world, if that was the case, he was also greatly diminished in value. They hadn't heard of the ADA. They hadn't heard of ways in which folks who have disabilities should be respected and so on. And so he was really living in not only an obscure circumstance anyway. To make matters worse, he had this disability that actually complicated his life considerably. So the king asked the question, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, well, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-debar. Machir is a man of wealth and importance. He's not a family member of Saul, but he is loyal. He's a Benjamite. He's loyal to the house of Saul, and he has apparently been helping out some of these family members of Saul, keeping them provided for, because they're in a state of some poverty at this point. He's providing for them. Machir, however, was equal opportunity in his willingness to help. He actually provided considerable help to David when David was running for his life from Absalom, story we're going to look at later. So he was a good man, and I think David appreciated that. He maintained a protective loyalty to the house of Saul, but David was impressed with the loyalty and the quality of his character all the way around. He was in Lo-debar. Lo-debar is on the other side of the Jordan. It's really at the very heart of where Saul had exercised his power. Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, had attempted to rule from there for a time. So that's where Machir is, and that's where these people are being cared for. Well, David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lo-debar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. Then David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, here is your servant. I don't know what Ziba told Mephibosheth. I don't know if he was straight up with him and said, look, King David says he wants to treat you well. I'm not so sure. I don't know if Ziba just said, hey, it's your lucky day, I don't know. I do have a pretty good feeling that Mephibosheth was braced for the worst, he was fully expecting the usual fate for members of a dethroned dynasty. In the ancient Near East and in many occasions throughout history, when a new family takes the rule, the old family is in big, big trouble. And it's not unusual to just have a kind of liquidation of life to prevent anyone making a side claim to the throne. And everybody would have understood if David had done that. It would have been beneath David's character, certainly, but no one would have been surprised if he had behaved in that way, least of all Mephibosheth himself. Mephibosheth remembered the recent incident. We looked at this some time back, in which 7 men from the house of Saul were lined up and executed in atonement for Saul's campaign against the Gibeonites. Remember that? Another complicated story in this history, and Mephibosheth knew about that. And he probably thought he was number 8 on the list. And so for all those reasons, he is approaching this with a high degree of fear, I suppose, maybe resigned to an outcome, but maybe a slender little bit of hope is in there is in there. So David said to him the sweetest words he ever heard, "Do not fear." Command from the king, do not fear. For I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. One commentator said, and I can't say to you I've confirmed it, but I'll pass it on, that the command in the Bible that's given more frequently than any other command to God's people is the command, don't fear. Because God knows we tend to be fearful people, Another commentator said the command, do not fear, is found 365 times in the Bible. One for every day. I've not confirmed that either, so just for what it's worth. But I'm going to tell you one man who was moved probably to the point of absolute astonishment by such a command was named Mephibosheth, who heard King David tell him not to fear. David loved Jonathan. Jonathan loved David. And all of that translated into amazing benefit for Mephibosheth. Again, commentators from a Christian perspective can't help but see in this a little vision of the benefit that flows to us. The Mephibosheth in this story. The Father loved the Son loved the Father. The depth of love in the Trinity has devolved to us as unbelievable, immeasurable, incalculable blessing. Not that we deserve it, but that love within God's own being translates into great benefit for us, just as it did in the case of Mephibosheth. Not only is Mephibosheth going to recover his own property, but what David is handing to Mephibosheth now is all of Saul's estate, land holdings, property, all of it, which was still a significant amount of property. For Mephibosheth, this was a rags to riches moment that was almost beyond any computation at all. But bear in mind that for Ziba, it was exactly the opposite. Because all of that, by the ordinary course of events, would have become his if nobody had dared to step forward and claim it. And now by a royal decree, all of this that Ziba had already been treating more or less as his own, and expecting he could someday leave it to his family, is just in a heartbeat taken from him and given to Mephibosheth, who Ziba had only recently been kind of discounting as a guy that's crippled in both his feet, you see. This is part of the reason we have to keep our eye on this is because when David is running from Absalom sometime later, Ziba plays a very, very interesting and somewhat duplicitous role in that. And it gives us some reason to believe that that's really what's going on here. So I'm kind of emphasizing that because we'll be looking at Absalom and his coup soon enough. So anyway, just keep that in mind as we proceed along. Well, anyway, not only is Mephibosheth given the opportunity to recover all of the property of Saul and the income thereof, but he's actually, even more than that, offered a place at the table of the king, which would be regarded as a place of sanctuary, of protection, of provision. That was really the sense David had in mind when in the 23rd Psalm he said, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. I may be surrounded by enemies, but the table at which I eat is the table of the king." And thus it's a place of protection and provision. It meant that you became technically what was called the king's friend because you share together the meal with him. That would be an honor actually exceeding the honor of receiving back the property. This was an astonishing change of circumstance for our friend Mephibosheth. It, of course, would be remiss not to remind all of us that that is exactly what's happening when we as Christian people come to the table of the King, the Lord's table. He invites us to his table, a royal place of provision, protection, sanctuary, sustenance, and we are called the King's friend. It's an unbelievable privilege, greatly exceeding anything Mephibosheth enjoyed when we are told the table is set, come and eat, this is laid out, this is offered for you. And this story, we can't help but see something of that remarkable privilege that's ours in it. Well, Mephibosheth, clearly overwhelmed, bowed himself and said, "What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I?" Of course, we would expect that kind of humble response, and it says good things about Mephibosheth, that he owns, in a sense, by saying such a thing, that none of this was anything he deserved, that this really does represent mercy on the part of the king toward him, who he's prepared to style himself as a dead dog. I appreciated Pastor John within the last few weeks mentioning in a sermon that he knew someone who didn't like the phrase in the hymn written by John Newton, Amazing Grace, referring to a wretch. Remember that? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. And this person was protesting, "I don't really like to consider myself a wretch." To which I think we have to say with all, polite candor, if you don't like to consider yourself a wretch before God, then you probably shouldn't consider yourself a Christian before God. Because Christians are people who have embraced with gusto the conviction that they are wretches, helpless, absolutely unable to do one lousy thing to please God except by God's grace. Mephibosheth got that. And any true Christian understands we live by mercy. Every breath we take is more than we deserve from the hand of a God who holds our breath in his hand, as Daniel reminded Belshazzar one day there in the book of Daniel. That's who we are. And we could easily stand there, kneel there with Mephibosheth and say, "Why are you treating such a dead dog as I with this kind of generous benevolence?" That's what Christianity is all about. And that's what Mephibosheth really illustrates for us, I think, dramatically in this incident. Well, the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "I've given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and all his house." Strictly, it was the grandson of his master, but the Hebraic expression would commonly apply in that way. Everything, the estates, the income, all of it being given to Mephibosheth, and by implication, being taken away from Ziba. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. He was a pretty well-to-do guy already. The food that's being referred to here is not simply food for Mephibosheth. He couldn't eat that much, and he was going to eat at the king's table anyway. This is, by extension, David giving a kind of blanket, reprieve, release to all of the family of Saul, who were all part of the extended family of Mephibosheth. That this property of Saul was going to be used to sustain them. In a sense, what David is doing is giving them permission to come out of hiding, that he has no malicious intent toward them. Ziba himself had risen to a position of significance, and as much as this was good for the family of Saul, it was a huge demotion, of course, for Ziba himself. Ziba said to the king, what else could he do? You know, according to all that my Lord has commanded his servant, so your servant will do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Ziba may not have liked it too much, but at this point, of course, he's not going to tip his hand, and he accepts this cheerfully enough, I'm sure. It was a radical reversal for both of these men. And the conclusion we reach here in verse 12 and 13, Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem and ate continually at the king's table and was lame in both his feet. That last reminder concerning this man. Micah is mentioned later. He is the oldest son, the only son we know of Mephibosheth, who by this time is a young man, married, and has a child. When Mephibosheth died, Micah came to represent the remains of the house of Saul, and that lineage continued for centuries, all the way down to the Babylonian captivity. We have that record in 1 Chronicles chapter 8. And so the family of Mephibosheth from this point on was a prominent family in Israel and continued to have that kind of respect in her history. We are again reminded, though, that this man to whom all of this was given was really helpless, not in any bargaining position at all, not only because he was of the family of the jilted house of Saul, but then he was also lame in both his feet, and just a kind of pathos is added to the story there at the end. So he had little to offer, much to receive. All right, Sunday school lesson. When things seem to be taking their stand against us, we must trust that even those circumstances are intended to bring peace. David probably woke up one morning and he heard about Hadadezer, and he heard about the Syrians and the rumblings of the Edomites, and he said, you know, I should be selling life insurance somewhere. Why am I the king? Why am I facing all of this, hostility all around me? How am I going to get out of this alive? That probably crossed David's mind once or twice when it seemed that he was surrounded by all of this hostility. Every nation on his perimeter, with the exception of Toy, the one guy who really takes a better path here, seemed to be out to get David. And David could have lost heart at that point, but he didn't. And we sometimes find ourselves, I suppose, similarly feeling like everything in my life is marshaled against me. Things are going wrong right to left, and if it's not this, it's that, And, not always, but sometimes we feel that way. So if you ever feel that way, remember David. He was having a pretty dark night there for a while when these things were happening. And yet God's purpose in it was to cause all of these things to work together for good, for peace, even in his life, even at the time when it didn't seem like that was quite so probable. When things seem to be at peace, with little threat of disruption, we must never rest on our laurels, but always renew our humility before God. Sometimes everything's going sideways, sometimes things are fine. David, really, we're going to see next week, had reached a point where things seemed pretty good. All of these enemies had more or less been neutralized. He was doing a mop-up operation in Ammon, and it was then, in a sense, resting on his laurels that he became susceptible to a temptation that would be defining for the rest of his life, involving Bathsheba. Let the man who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Sometimes life is really rough, sometimes it's really good, sometimes we have greater peril when life seems to be good than when life is rough. So we need to keep our eye on both those prospects. And then finally this, whether in peace or in conflict, we must never forget or neglect our astonishing privilege of joining the family meal at the King's table. At the heart of all of it, whether things are going well or not so well, we keep coming back to the sacrament. We keep coming back to an invitation to our King to be close to Him. And if we stay close to Him, then regardless of the circumstances otherwise, we know we're in a place of protection, provision, sanctuary, safety, and friendship with our Lord. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we are grateful for this man who was human, mightily used by God, and yet certainly not perfect. We are grateful that we can see in him those things that encourage us. We're also especially grateful this morning for this character, Mephibosheth, who reminds us of ourselves. And as he was the one who could stand before a king receiving nothing but grace, we know that we similarly stand before our great King, receiving nothing but grace. And for that we are deeply grateful, acknowledging that you are a God of mercy to us who don't deserve it, and in that we will rejoice eternally. And for all of that we give you thanks in the name of Christ.